Distrust of crowds dates back to at least the classical period, probably earlier. The deaths of both Socrates and Christ were blamed on mobs by Plato and the Gospel authors, respectively. Roman leaders famously turned to bread and circuses to harness and diffuse the crowd's libido and bloodlust into what they hoped would be manageable proportions. Following the French Revolution in 1789, the strange wildness of crowds became a fashionable preoccupation of the new academic field of sociology. The French historian Hippolyte Taine saw the crowd as hopelessly, irredeemably sentimental and pre-rational. The sociologist Gabriel Tarde said the crowd was a wild beast without a name, setting the stage for the father of crowd theory, sociologist Gustave Le Bon, whose 1895 book, The Crowd, argued that the crowd's transformative innocence and simplicity provided the perfect target for political opportunists and demagogues, who we would call today outside agitators, to press their cunning advantage on. Through what he dubbed the law of mental unity, Le Bon believed that crowd psychology short-circuited the capacity for personal introspection so thoroughly that for most people, once in the grips of it, it was nearly impossible to find their way to moral reasoning. Crowd members had ceased to become individuals, able to act only in crude and primitive fashion. No mere crowd could ever hope to muster the creativity or insight needed to propel society forward. Only an individual could do that. The Italian sociologist and criminologist Scipio Segele took this line of thinking one step further. Crowds make good people bad. In 1840, at the height of the Jacksonian period in America, when anxieties about mob rule were rippling through society, a literary magazine called Atkinson's Casket ran a piece called The Man of the Crowd by Edgar Allan Poe. In this story, the protagonist sits in a London coffee house after just having recovered from an illness. His mood is exultant, and he takes sensual pleasure out of the most ordinary activities, reading the paper, watching the other patrons in the cafe, and finally, as night begins to fall, gazing on the bustle in the street outside. He spends some time observing the throng of people heading home from work or en route to dinner engagements or just up to no good, surveying them as they pass, the merchants, the aristocrats, the clerks, the peddlers, the gamblers, the pickpockets, and prostitutes. The narrator amuses himself with this activity for several hours, until one face in particular, that of an old decrepit man, snaps him from his reverie. Alone among everyone he has been observing, the expression on this man's face is unique and inscrutable to him. It resists being catalogued. A confusion of contradictory impressions fills the narrator's mind, and he is compelled to rush into the street and follow the old man, hoping that closer observation will help him understand the man's place and the multitudes weaving around him. Through the streets of London, the narrator tails his subject, who seems to have nowhere in particular to go, with no hurry to get there. When the sun comes up, the narrator is briefly startled to find himself outside the coffee house he started from. But he gathers himself together and continues his pursuit through the next day, until evening comes again, and finally, exhausted and still having learned nothing coherent from his chase, he resorts to one last deep, hard look into the old man's face, before leaving him to continue his wanderings unmolested. He concludes in defeat that the old man is unknowable and unfathomable, saying, "This old man is the type and the genius of deep crime. He refuses to be alone. He is the man of the crowd. It will be in vain to follow, for I shall learn no more of him, nor of his deeds." The crowd is untruth, wrote Soren Kierkegaard a few years after Poe's story was published. Even if every individual possessed the truth in private, he continued, if they came together in a crowd, untruth would at once be let in. Kierkegaard reasoned that since God offers his children salvation or damnation on an individual basis, soul by soul, then to take one's place in a crowd is to deny him the substrate by which he would judge you. It would be impossible to as much as say or hear a true thing without God's direct mediation, since how could the wellspring of truth itself not participate in its transmission? Taking one's place in a crowd, then, is to become unseen by God, which is to say, unreal. Try to share a truth with a crowd and you become a statistic, a specimen, a representation, an unsold non-self. Kierkegaard's biggest concern about crowds was the erosion of personal accountability. An anonymous person in a crowd might say things they never would have the courage to express alone without fear of reprisal. Only individuals can apprehend the divine. Only individuals can be truly free, which to Kierkegaard meant first and foremost the freedom to commit acts of martyrdom. Writing about 90 years later, in the pause between two world wars, Walter Benjamin looked around him at the lingering generational trauma of total war and described the individual of his day as, quote, screaming like a newborn baby in the dirty diapers of the present. The ability to directly speak of their experience from mouth to ear had been taken away from the soldiers who returned home from the Great War. They had nothing true to relate except for a litany of pointless atrocities that they did not want to speak aloud and which no one around them wanted to hear. Into the vacuum created by this dearth of shared experience, Benjamin said, gushed an overflowing river of frivolous cultural forms, palmistry, astrology, spiritualism, abundant but unconnected to lived experience because magical thinking is private, it can't be shared. Looking anxiously ahead at the coming war, Benjamin wondered if the people of his milieu would be able to recognize their cultural bankruptcy and embrace what he called positive barbarianism, where, having dismissed the pretense of having a living, breathing culture, one is free to start from scratch and reconnect to the world of life and death. It's a strange choice of words, barbarianism. In episode 4, I mentioned that barbarian was originally a Greek word for someone who didn't speak Greek, but that's not quite the case. The root word barbaros means babbler, implying that the person described spoke no actual language at all, that the best they could do was clumsily mimic human speech, or perhaps implying that the listener could not be bothered to figure out if there were languages other than their own, expressing thoughts and feelings just as sublime as theirs, or perhaps even more so. That might be something they prefer not to find out. To be a barbarian, therefore, was to lack civilization, even the ability to reason. In the place of reason, one was sure to find prejudice, superstition, cruelty, and violence, which is why it was so important to put up the strongest gates and fortifications against barbarians to keep them out. These caricatures don't seem like very good candidates, though, for the rejuvenation Benjamin was talking about. So what then? To illustrate what starting from scratch might look like, he offers the examples of Paul Klee and Albert Einstein, famously iconoclastic, practically avatars of individual achievement and contribution. But in mentioning this, I must admit that my language instantly struggles against me, gesturing back towards the paradox. The original prototypical iconoclasts in 8th century Byzantium were not mavericks, freethinkers, or lone wolves. They were military factotums carrying out the edict of their emperor, Leo III, to smash the holy icons in Byzantine churches. They were basically stormtroopers, utterly typifying Kierkegaard's description of the crowd as the nullification of the individual. Positive barbarianism eludes us again. In one of his most quoted lines, written shortly before his death in 1940, Benjamin declared, "There is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism." By this time, war had come, and it's not impossible that the reality of it had shattered whatever hopefulness might have been ensconced in his call for a start from scratch just a few years before. But the German language also has its share of rhinestones. The German word Benjamin reaches for when describing horror and atrocity, as in this late 1940 quote, is Barbarei, meaning inhuman cruelty, barbarism. When proposing his positive barbarianism, though, he uses a different word, possibly one that he coined himself, barbarentum. In English, the literal translation would be something like barbarianhood or barbarianness. The literature scholar Kevin McLaughlin has suggested that the use of such a clunky made-up word may even be a little joke, gesturing toward the way forward. The silly, unexpected word barbarianness breaks the spell. We can send home the barbarian from central casting and usher in the genuine article, the creative spirit who can erase the traces and build something new, however barbaric it might seem to people with too rigid a sense of civilization. As far as I've come into this digression, I might as well also wheel in one last famous quote about barbarism and culture, written in 1949 by Benjamin's friend and colleague Theodor Adorno. Nach Auschwitz ein Gedicht zu schreiben ist barbarisch. Writing a poem after Auschwitz is barbaric. This utterance was taken by Adorno's readers to mean either that one could not or should not write poetry after Auschwitz, which seems so patently false that Adorno ended up disavowing the quote in later works. But maybe, somewhere in the back of his mind, Adorno had been reminded of the positive barbarianism of his old friend, who, unlike Adorno, did not outlive the Third Reich and never had the chance to look back on it for lessons. Maybe writing a poem after Auschwitz demands a radical departure from the barbarism of the culture, high and low alike, that permitted the operation of the camps. At the end of his essay on experience and poverty, Benjamin nods again to the crowd, writing that culture and norms have become, quote, the monopoly of a few powerful people who, God knows, are no more human than the many. For the most part, they are more barbaric and not in the good way. Let us hope that from time to time the individual will give a little humanity to the masses, who one day will repay him with compound interest.